Hello, I'm Scott. Welcome to the 6th episode in our barrel modelling tutorial series in Autodesk Maya. What we've done so far is we modelled out the barrel by using a cylinder, adding edge loops, extruding and beveling areas of the object to get the geometry and then smooth it out. We added a second cylinder to the top for our nozzle, and then we combined that and rebuilt the geometry on the top of the model so that it's all one object. And we've started the process of UV mapping by using a cylindrical unwrap on the outside and a planar map on the top and bottom, and flipping the faces so that there's no back to front UVs. What we're going to go on to now is we're going to UV map out the nozzle, and then we're going to start UV mapping out the lips of the barrel here. So if we start with the nozzle, we're going to want to go right click and hover over face, and we're going to click and double click the adjacent faces here while using the shift key held down to give us this whole ring. We're going to do the same again here, and we're just going to do create and cylindrical. Now we can see here that there's stretching on these faces, so what we need to do is we need to hit R and we need to scale this in one direction so that it makes these back into squares again. So if we scale this along the way, it's going to bring these back in line until they're square, like so. Because the problem here was that when we did our cylindrical unwrap, the faces on this weren't wide enough to account for the UV space on the faces here. So now that we've got these scaled out and they're about the same size as the squares on this material area here, we know that the texture density is the same on the nozzle as on the barrel lid. So we can move this out of the way now. Now we need to do the top of the nozzle as well. So we're going to use another planar map for this like we did for the top of the barrel. We're going to use shift, and we're just going to double click the face next to that. I'm just going to press Q to get this little move tool out of the way. We're going to hold down tab, and we're just going to paint these top faces, and we're going to do a create. We're going to go into the little options box, we're going to check it's the y-axis again still, and we're just going to project that. Now the squares on the top here are a little bit bigger than the squares down below, so we're just going to bring this up a bit still in its scale so that they're around about the same. Now that looks better, so we're just going to move that up to the side like so. Now we're going to move on to the lips next, and this gets a little bit complicated. We're going to use a tool called Unitize, and the way the Unitize tool works is for every face we have selected, it makes it its own UV shell, and it makes the shell the exact size of our 1 by 1 UV square here. But we can edit what we've done with that later. But the reason we use this is by unitizing and stitching back together, we avoid distortion from doing a cylindrical unwrap on faces that are flat, or from doing repeated planar operations, or from doing automatic operations and trying to stitch heaps of faces back together. It's a bit of a long process, but it works out where we have more control over where our UV density is and without running the risk of distortion. So because we know that we have all our top faces, we have our nozzle done, and we have the sides of our barrel done, all the faces left in this UV square here are the lips. So we'll just do UV shell. We'll select all of the things inside our box here, and that will give us all the faces left to UV out. And we'll go to modify, and we're going to go to Unitize, and we're just going to click that. So now each of these faces is its own whole thing, so there's a lot of faces layered up here. I'm just going to move these back with Control Z. We need to turn those back into bands of faces like we see here. So the way we do that is we find where our seam was from our cylindrical unwrap, because we want to keep the seam the same throughout. And we're going to go into edge. We're just going to look underneath here so that we can get this first edge loop. And what we want is we want the vertical edges. So we want to click this one, hold shift, double click the one next to it, and that will give us all those vertical edges running round. Now before we do anything more, we want to hold shift and we want to click again on the edge above our seam, which is the white line. So we want this white line, the one above it, we want to click again and deselect, because we need a seam where there's two ends that meet otherwise it's going to ruin the UVs and we're going to have just a messy object. So we're just going to keep doing this as we go up. We're going to select one, double click the one next to it, then deselect the one above the seam. So we're going to click, double click, and deselect the one above the seam. We're going to make sure we're holding shift as we do this the whole time as well. So we're just going to get everything in these loops as it goes round. And this does take a fair bit of time, and it can be a bit fiddly sometimes if you've got small edges like we do here, but it's worth the time invested when you save yourself a lot of hassle with UVs later on. So we're just going to keep that seam the whole way, like so. We're just going to jump back down to the bottom again, and we're going to do the same again down here, where we're going to select one holding shift, double click the next, and we're going to deselect the one on the seam, and again double click, deselect the seam, and just keep going round this lip on the bottom like so. Now you can see that a lot of these UV areas are distorted just now from the Unitize, but we fix that in the next step. So just holding shift down the whole time, we make sure that that seam runs right the way up the object, and all the rest of the edges are in orange. So now that we've done that, we're going to go over here into our UV editor again, and with this little cut and sew menu, we're just going to click stitch together, which what we've done now is we've selected all of the vertical edges and we've left this one seam. So when we hit stitch together, everything we have selected in orange is going to get stitched to its neighbour. So this face will be stitched to this face, and so all the way around. So we're going to get all these little bands of faces that we can then fix the density on and fix any distortion on, and then we can stitch the vertical edges together after that to make them similar to our big cylindrical unwrap here. So we're going to click stitch together. It's going to take a little while to load because it's a lot of stitching operations at one time. The reason that we can't do a cylindrical for this is similarly to when we did our planar on the wrong axis and it made this one big flat face. If we try and cylindrical the lips here, it's not going to catch these upward facing faces or the downward facing ones. It's just going to show them as a invisible little space that's not going to exist. It's not going to capture that, so we can't really use cylindrical for this, so it just requires a bit more work. Now what we've got here looks a bit weird, but it's because it orientates these shells based on what it thinks they should be direction wise, but it doesn't matter what way they're facing because we just need to select them one by one in here. So we're going to hold right click and we're going to go to UV shell while we're in the editor window. If you want to select UV shell from here, it's a different path to get there. We hold right click, we go to UV, and then we go to UV shell. But what we can do is these are all banded into big shells now, so we can click one of them and it's going to highlight it here, and we can zoom in on it a bit and we can see we've got really thin faces that are really stretched out. So what we need to do is we need to make these squares first, and then we want the squares to match in size with the ones underneath. So it requires a bit of work and it looks weird when you're doing it, but it's just all about focusing on are these square or not. So we're just going to keep scaling it in one direction until these are squared, which they look to be now, and then we can use this little double direction scale in our UV window to bring it back down in size until the squares match the size below. So we want to scale up until we get rid of the stretching, and then scale both directions down to keep them square but make the squares match in size to the lid of the barrel, which should be about there. So what we'll do now is we'll just move that off to the side, don't need it anymore, and we'll do the next one up. So we're going to scale this out the way, and just a little bit more than that, until they're square, and then we're going to scale it back down the way until the size of the squares matches up roughly, so just about there, and we'll just move that out of the way with W as well. It doesn't matter if these sit over the top of each other, because we're going to stitch these together again soon anyway. So we're just going to keep doing that around the model. Just going to keep scaling these until they're square, and then drop the scale right back down again until they match up, and we'll move these out of the way. So it's the same process all the way around, shell by shell. And once you've done it, what you want to do is you want to right click, and you want to go to edge, and we want to double click the edge loops running round the way, and hold shift and double click again, and we're going to click stitch together, and it's going to merge these into another UV shell. So we can do that all the way around the top lip and all the way around the bottom lip. So I'm going to finish that up now, and then in the next video I'll show you where we go for the final few steps on this model once we've performed the Unitize scale and stitch on all these little face bands. So I will see you in the next video when this UV map should be finished.